The city was dead. Tall buildings, once shining with light, now stood like broken teeth. The streets were covered with black dust, and smoke rose slowly from the ruins. Everything smelled of fire, iron, and sorrow. In the middle of this broken world, two small figures moved quietly. They were sisters. Young alien girls, thin and weak, their faces marked with ash. They had no shoes, their feet cut by stones, their clothes torn. Still, they held each other's hands, walking step by step, searching for a place to rest. The night was colder than the day. The stars above gave no warmth, only a reminder that the world had changed forever. The younger sister coughed, her small chest shaking with weakness. The older one pulled her close, whispering softly, "Don't cry, don't let them hear us." But her voice was trembling too. They reached the corner of a street where once a shop had stood. Now only ashes, broken walls, and burnt wood remained. The older sister guided the younger to sit in the gray ashes. She brushed some aside to make a small hollow like a bed. It was dirty, cold, and full of dust, but it was all they had. The younger sister closed her eyes. "I'm not hungry," she whispered, though her stomach made a painful sound. The older one smiled weakly. She always smiled, even when it hurt. She wanted to be strong so her sister would not lose hope, but deep inside she was afraid. Afraid that tomorrow her sister might not wake up. Afraid that the soldiers would find them. Afraid that the world had no place for children like them anymore. They curled together in the ashes. The cold wind blew across their faces. They tried to sleep, but sleep never came easily. Every sound in the ruins felt like danger. Every shadow looked like an enemy. And then it happened. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Footsteps echoed in the silence of the street. The sisters froze, their eyes wide with fear. Someone was coming. They pressed closer to the ground, trying to hide behind broken stones. Their small hearts beat so fast they thought the stranger might hear. The older sister whispered, "Stay quiet. Don't move." The younger nodded, though her body shook with terror. The footsteps grew louder, closer. A tall shadow stretched across the ground near them. For a moment, they thought it was a soldier, a cruel scavenger who would take everything or hurt them. The older sister grabbed a sharp stone, ready to fight though she had no strength. If anyone tried to touch her sister, she would not give up easily. The shadow stopped. The air felt heavy. The sisters dared to look up, and what they saw confused them even more. It was not an alien soldier. It was not one of their kind either. It was different. A tall figure stood there, wrapped in a long cloak. His face was half hidden in the dark, but his eyes were strange. They carried both sadness and strength. He was a human. The sisters had heard stories of humans before. Stories, told in whispers. Humans were supposed to be dangerous, brutal, and merciless, the kind of beings who survived any war by fighting harder than anyone else. So why was he here, in these ruined streets? And why was he looking at them? Not with anger, but with something else, something they could not understand. The older sister pushed her sister behind her. "Go away," she whispered, her voice shaking. But the human did not move forward. He raised his hands slowly, showing they were empty. He meant no harm. The sisters exchanged a quick glance. They did not know if they should trust him, but before they could decide, the human knelt down. From under his cloak, he pulled out something. The sisters tensed, afraid it was a weapon. But it was not. It was a blanket. A simple, thick, warm blanket. The human spread it open and placed it gently on the ground. Then he gestured for them to take it. His movements were careful, slow, like he understood how fragile they were. The sisters stared, their eyes wide. They had not felt warmth in weeks, not since the fires of war took everything, not since their parents were gone. The younger sister's lips trembled. Why would he do this?" she whispered. The older one had no answer. Her hand shook as she reached out, touching the edge of the blanket. It was real, soft, and warmer than anything they remembered. The human watched them quietly, His face was unreadable, but his eyes. Softened, he pulled the blanket closer, wrapping it gently around the sisters. For the first time in many nights, the cold did not bite so hard. The ashes beneath them no longer felt like death. The sisters sat in silence, staring at him. Confusion, mixed with hope. Fear mixed with relief. They did not understand who he was, but one thing was clear. This human was not their enemy. The night stretched on, but for the first time in a long time, the sisters were not alone in the ashes, and somewhere deep inside, their hearts, a small flame of hope began to burn again. The blanket felt heavy on the sisters' shoulders, not heavy like a burden, but heavy like safety. They had almost forgotten what warmth was. Now it covered them like a shield against the cold night, but the question burned inside their minds. Who was this stranger? And why would a human of all beings care for them? The older sister kept her arms around the younger, her eyes never leaving the man in the cloak. He had sat down near the broken wall, not too close, not too far, as if he knew they were afraid, as if he wanted them to feel they had a choice. The younger sister whispered, "Is he going to take us away?" Her voice cracked like dry wood. The older sister shook her head, though she had no real answer. "I don't know." "But don't speak loud." The human said nothing. His face was calm, but his eyes carried a storm of tiredness. There were scars near his jaw, old marks of battles they could not imagine. His cloak smelled faintly of smoke and iron, like he had also walked through war and ruin. After a long silence, the human moved. The sisters tensed instantly. The older one gripped a piece of stone, her whole body shaking but ready to defend her sister. The younger hid half her face under the blanket, her wide eyes glowing faintly in the dim firelight. The human did not reach for a weapon. Instead, he opened a small bag from his side. He pulled out a piece of food, wrapped in cloth, a piece of bread, rough but real. The smell made the sisters' empty stomachs twist painfully. The human broke the bread in two. Slowly, he placed the pieces in front of them on the ground. Then he leaned back again, showing his hands open. No threat, no demand. The younger sister looked at the bread. Her mouth watered, her fingers shook, but she did not move. She turned to her sister, waiting for permission. The older one's throat tightened. Was it a trick? Was it poisoned? Or was it really kindness? The human spoke. His voice was deep, steady. The words were strange, not their language, but the tone was soft, like a lullaby. He said something short, and his hand made a gentle gesture. "Eat," the sisters stared at him. Then slowly the older one picked up the bread. She smelled it first, then broke off a tiny piece. She put it in her mouth. It was rough and dry, but it was food. Real food. Her eyes filled with tears she had tried to hide for days. She gave the other half to her younger sister. The little one ate quickly, too quickly. Crumbs fell down her face. The older sister tried to slow her down, but the human only gave a small nod. It was fine. He understood hunger. For a long time, they sat in silence. Only the sound of chewing and the crackling of a weak fire filled the air. The sisters kept glancing at him. Every time they looked, they found him watching, not in anger, not in cruelty, but with an expression they could not explain. Something like sorrow. Something like guilt. The older sister finally spoke. Her words were quiet, but firm. Why are you helping us?" Of course he did not understand, but he seemed to hear the question in her voice. He tapped his chest, then pointed at them, then to the sky above. The sisters exchanged confused glances. What did that mean? He tried again. He pressed his hand to his chest firmly, then pointed at the younger sister's tears. His face softened, and though they did not understand the words, they understood the meaning. He cared. The older sister lowered her stone, her body still tense but a little less afraid. The younger one whispered, "He is not like the others." The older nodded slowly. "Yes, he is different. The night grew deeper. Cold wind shook the broken city. Somewhere far away, voices echoed. Alien soldiers on patrol. The sisters stiffened again, but the human lifted his finger to his lips. Stay silent. He moved toward the broken wall, crouching like a hunter. Every step was quiet, practiced. He was a soldier once, maybe still. But tonight, he was their guard. The sisters huddled under the blanket. Watching him stand firm in the shadows, every sound outside made their hearts pound. But the human never flinched. He was like a wall of flesh and bone protecting two small lives that were not even his own. Time passed slowly. Minutes felt like hours. But the danger moved away. The voices faded. The footsteps vanished into the distance. The human returned and sat near them again. He breathed out slowly, his chest heavy with exhaustion. Yet, his eyes softened once more when they met the sister's gaze. The younger sister whispered, "He stayed. He didn't leave us." The older one said nothing, but inside her heart something cracked open. For days she had carried only fear. Now, a tiny piece of trust was born. The human stranger had come to them from the ashes, and though his face was unknown, his actions spoke louder than any language. For the first time, the sisters felt they might not be alone anymore, and in that broken city, surrounded by ruins, the seed of a bond began to grow. The blanket was more than just cloth. For the sisters, it was like a shield against the world. Soft, warm, and smelling faintly of smoke and leather, it wrapped around their thin bodies, and for the first time in many nights, they felt something, close to comfort. The younger sister pulled the blanket tight to her chest. Her eyes shone with relief. She whispered to the older one, "It feels like home, like when Mother covered us at night." The words stabbed deep into the older sister's heart. Home was gone. Mother was gone. But at least this moment gave her sister something to hold on to. The human sat nearby, his back against the wall, his cloak still draped over one shoulder. He looked tired, like a man who had walked through endless battles. Yet his eyes stayed sharp, scanning the ruins. Every sound in the distance made him alert. He was not only resting, he was guarding them. The older sister could not understand him. She did not know his name, but his actions spoke clearly. He had given them warmth, he had given them food. Now, without a word, he gave them safety. Still, doubt lingered in her heart. Why? Why would a human do this? Stories had always painted humans as wild creatures, beings who would burn and take without mercy. But this one did the opposite. This one shared what little he had. The night pressed down heavier. The ashes blew across the street. Somewhere, far away, a low boom shook the broken walls. An explosion, maybe from soldiers or scavengers. The sisters flinched, pulling the blanket tighter. The human leaned forward, eyes narrowing. He lifted his hand toward them in a calming gesture. "Stay calm, stay quiet." The younger sister pressed her face into the older's shoulder. Tears slipped down her cheeks. The older stroked her hair, but her eyes never left the human. She was still watching, still testing. If he betrayed them, she would know. Hours crawled by. The small fire between them began to fade. The cold crept in again. The human noticed. He stood and walked away into the rubble. The sisters panicked, thinking he was leaving for good. The younger cried softly, "He left us." But before the older could answer, the human returned. In his hands were broken wood pieces. He placed them carefully onto the fire. Flames grew, again brighter. Pushing back the darkness, the sisters' eyes widened. Not only had he stayed, he had worked to keep them warm. The younger whispered, "He came back. He didn't leave." The older one nodded slowly. Her doubts cracked a little more. As the fire glowed, the human reached into his cloak once more. This time he pulled out something small. A metal flask, scratched and dented. He opened it and poured a little into a small cup. Steam rose. It was warm water. He placed the cup near the sisters, nodding gently. "Drink." The older one hesitated, but her sister's dry lips and weak breath left her no choice. She guided the cup to her sister's hands. The little girl sipped, then gasped at the warmth. She smiled for the first time in weeks. The human watched quietly, his face unreadable. But his eyes softened again at the sight. The sisters did not know the human story, but his silence told more than words. He was alone, too. Perhaps he had lost people. Perhaps he carried his own ghosts, and maybe, just maybe, helping them was the only way he could feel human again. The younger sister, braver now, peeked out from under the blanket. Her voice was small. "What's your name?" Of course he did not understand. He tilted his head slightly, then pointed to himself. "Daniel," he said slowly. The sound of his voice was firm, a word they did not know, but they understood it was him. The older sister whispered the name back, her accent strange, but close enough. Neil." He gave a small nod, almost a smile. It was the first time they exchanged something real. Not just bread or warmth, but names. The night carried on. The sisters began to drift into sleep under the blanket, but the older kept her eyes half open. Through the flickering firelight, she saw Daniel sitting there, a silent guard, a stranger who became their wall against the world. And before her eyes finally closed, one thought whispered through her heart. Maybe this human was not a monster. Maybe, just maybe, he was their only chance to survive. The ruins were never silent for long. Even at night, the city groaned like a wounded beast. Metal cracked in the wind, stones shifted, and distant voices carried through the smoke. The sisters huddled under the blanket. Warm but uneasy, they knew danger was always close. Daniel, the human, sat with his back straight against the wall. He had not closed his eyes, not even once. His body looked tired, but his mind was sharp. Every sound made him turn his head. Slightly, every shadow caught his gaze. The sisters noticed, and though they were young, they understood. He was protecting them. The younger sister whispered, "Why does he watch like that?" The older sister replied softly, "He listens for danger. He doesn't want them to find us." She wasn't sure if her words were true, but when she looked at him, she felt they might be. Suddenly, a faint clatter echoed from the far end of the street. The younger gasped, clutching the blanket tight. The older held her close, heart pounding. Daniel's head snapped toward the sound. He raised his hand slowly, signaling them to stay down. His eyes hardened, and in that moment, he looked less like a stranger and more like a soldier. The sisters lay flat in the ashes. They could hear voices now, alien patrols, harsh, cold, searching for survivors. The older sister bit her lip so hard it bled. If they were caught, she knew what would happen. Slaves at best, corpses at worst. Daniel reached for the broken piece of metal he had carried. It wasn't much of a weapon, just sharpened rubble, but in his hands it looked deadly. He crouched low, body tense. The sisters held their breath, watching him move like a predator ready to strike. The voices grew closer. Boots crunched against the ash-covered ground. A beam of light swept across the ruins. The sisters trembled. One wrong move, one small sound, and they would be discovered. Daniel pressed a finger to his lips. His eyes locked with theirs. The message was clear. Do not move. Then he slipped away from the firelight. His steps were silent, practiced, like he had walked in shadows his whole life. The sisters buried their faces under the blanket, but curiosity forced the older one to peek. She saw him blend into the darkness, his body low, his movements careful. The patrol came into view, 2 alien soldiers scanning the area. One of them muttered something. The other swung his light toward the broken shop walls. Closer, closer. The younger sister's hand shook violently. She wanted to cry out, but the older covered her mouth. Her heart raced so loud she thought it would give them away. And then, the soldiers stopped. Their light fell on the ground where Daniel had been, but he was gone. A whisper of movement came from behind them. Daniel had circled like a shadow, one quick strike, and a rock hit the ground far away. The sound pulled the soldiers' attention. They turned. Weapons raised, muttering, they walked toward the noise, step by step. They moved away from the sister's hiding place. The older sister exhaled slowly, her hand still pressed against her sister's mouth. The danger wasn't gone, but Daniel had tricked them. He returned silently, his cloak brushing against the stones. His eyes were sharp, his breathing steady. Like protecting others was something he had done many times before. When he reached the sisters again, he gave a small nod, as if to say, "You're safe now." The older one's throat tightened. She whispered softly, even though he couldn't understand. "Thank you." Daniel sat again near the fire. But this time the sisters saw him differently. Not just a stranger with food, not just a man with a blanket. He was their shield, a silent protector who risked himself so they could live. The younger sister, braver now, crawled closer to him. She tugged at the edge of his cloak. He turned, surprised. Her small voice trembled. "Stay with us." The words were simple, broken, but the meaning was clear. Daniel didn't answer with words. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder, a gesture of promise. The older sister watched, her heart heavy, yet lighter than before. She realized something she never thought she would. This human, this stranger, was no longer just passing through. He had chosen to stay. The night carried on, the fire burned low, but the sisters did not shiver as before. The blanket kept them warm, and Daniel's presence kept fear away, even in a city of ashes, even in a world full of enemies. They had found something rare, someone who would stand between them and the darkness, someone who would fight, even if it cost him everything. For the first time, the older sister closed her eyes without fear. Her last thought before sleep was clear. He may not be one of us, but tonight, he is ours. The fire had burned low. Only faint orange embers glowed in the darkness. The sisters were wrapped in the blanket, lying close together, but their eyes were wide open, unable to sleep because the night was no longer quiet. Distant shouts echoed. Across the ruined city, torches flickered like fireflies in the dark streets. The sound of boots striking the ground grew louder. The hunters were out again, alien soldiers searching the ruins for survivors, not to rescue, but to capture. Daniel crouched near the broken wall. His body was still, but his eyes sharp. He could hear them long before they came near. He counted the steps, the voices, at least 4 of them, armed and searching. The sisters clung to each other, trembling. The younger whispered, "They will find us, won't they?" The older forced herself to shake her head. "No, not while he is here." The patrol drew closer. Their language was harsh and sharp. One of them barked an order. Another laughed cruelly. Their lights cut through the smoke and dust, sweeping across broken walls, closer. Daniel looked back at the sisters. He pressed his finger to his lips again. Silent. Then he pointed to the ground. "Stay low, don't move." The older sister nodded quickly, holding her little one tightly under the blanket. They lay flat, trying to blend with the ashes. He stepped forward, placing himself between them and danger like a wall of flesh and courage. The soldiers' lights danced across the ruins. One beam struck the wall near Daniel's head. He froze, blending into the shadow. The soldier narrowed his eyes, stepping closer. Daniel's grip tightened on the broken metal shard in his hand. It was no real weapon, but in his fingers it looked like death itself. The younger sister's breath came fast and loud. The older pressed a hand over her mouth. Tears ran down both their cheeks. They could see the enemy now. Tall figures with armored suits, claws of steel. Their helmets glowed faintly red in the night. Hunters of the ashes. The sisters had seen what they did to children, and the thought made their blood turn cold. One soldier raised his weapon, pointing it toward the rubble. The firelight reflected on his visor. The older sister squeezed her eyes shut. She whispered inside her heart, "Please let him protect us." And then Daniel moved. Not to fight directly, but to outthink. He picked up a chunk of stone and threw it far across the ruins. It clattered, loudly, bouncing against metal beams. The sound echoed through the night. The soldiers turned instantly, weapons raised. They barked orders, their voices sharp. All 4 began marching toward the sound. Away from the sisters, Daniel wasted no time. He crouched low, returning to the girls. He waved his hand for them to follow. His movements were urgent but quiet. The older sister understood. They had to move now. Before the patrol came back, pulled her younger sister up. Their legs weak, but fear gave them strength. The blanket still wrapped around them. They followed Daniel into the shadows of another street. Every step felt like a lifetime. Every sound made their hearts jump. Daniel moved like he knew the ruins better than anyone. He led them through narrow gaps between broken walls, over piles of debris, under collapsed beams, always checking, always listening. The sisters followed blindly, trusting him more with each step. But the danger wasn't gone. Behind them, the soldiers shouted again. They had discovered the trick. Their lights swept back across the ruins, closer, sharper. The hunt continued. Daniel pushed the girls into a broken cellar. It smelled of ash and damp stone. He crouched at the entrance, gripping his shard of metal tight. The sisters huddled in the corner, their hearts pounding. They could see his silhouette, broad shoulders, steady hands, a protector ready to bleed if it meant keeping them safe. The footsteps returned, boots striking closer. One soldier paused near the cellar opening. His light shone into the rubble. The sisters held their breath. The beam hovered just inches from Daniel's face. He did not flinch. His body blended with the shadow, like he had trained for this moment all his life. Then another soldier called out. The one at the cellar turned away. And just like that, the danger passed again. The soldiers moved deeper into the ruins, still hunting, still searching, but for now, they had missed their prey. Minutes felt like hours before Daniel lowered his weapon. He turned back to the sisters, his eyes softer again. He gave a small nod. Safe. For now. The younger sister broke into quiet sobs. She pressed her face into the blanket, her small voice shaking. He saved us again. The older one placed her hand gently on Daniel's arm. He looked at her, surprised. Her voice was a whisper. You are not like the others. Daniel didn't answer. He only looked at them for a long moment. Then he adjusted his cloak and sat at the cellar entrance once more, watching, listening, unmoving, unbroken. The silent protector of two children who should have been nothing to him but had somehow become everything. The night carried on, the hunt continued outside, but inside the cellar a fragile hope burned. The sisters realized that as long as Daniel stood, they still had a chance to see another dawn. The cellar was cold and damp. Drops of water fell from cracks in the stone above. The smell of ash and old fire still hung in the air, but to the sisters it felt safer than the open street. Daniel stood at the entrance, his body like a wall. His sharp eyes scanned the shadows beyond. Even when the footsteps faded and the voices of soldiers were gone, he did not relax. He remained still, patient, ready. The younger sister tugged gently on her sister's sleeve. Will he always stay like this? She whispered. Her voice was small, almost afraid to hope. The older one glanced at Daniel's back. She had no answer, but deep inside, something told her. Yes, he would. Hours passed slowly. The sisters leaned against each other, wrapped in the blanket, their eyes heavy with exhaustion, but they fought sleep because they feared the world outside, and because the man guarding them was still a mystery. At last, Daniel turned. He crouched near them, his rough face lit by faint firelight. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a small object. It was metal, old and scratched, but when he opened it, a faint light blinked inside. A communicator, broken, useless now. He looked at it for a long moment, then closed it and placed it gently on the ground. The sisters didn't understand, but they could see sorrow in his eyes. The older sister dared to ask. Her voice was low, trembling. You lost someone, didn't you? He didn't understand her words, but her tone carried the meaning. Daniel's eyes softened. He nodded once, slowly. The sisters fell silent. They knew the feeling too well. The younger sister reached out. Her small fingers brushed against his hand. Daniel looked surprised, but he did not pull away. Instead, he let her touch. Her voice was fragile but full of warmth. "You, safe," she said, the words broken but clear. Daniel's lips curved into the faintest smile. It was the first time the sisters had seen him soften so much. That small gesture broke the wall between them. The older sister placed her hand over her heart, then pointed at him, then at her sister. She whispered slowly, "Family." Daniel tilted his head, but then he repeated the gesture, his hand over his chest, then pointing to them. "Family," he said in his heavy voice. The word was strange on his tongue, but in that moment it was real. The sisters' eyes filled with tears. For so long they had felt abandoned, forgotten. But now, sitting in the ashes, a human stranger had called them family. The younger sister leaned against him, her small head resting against his arm. At first, Daniel froze, unsure, but then he let out a quiet breath and carefully adjusted the blanket to cover all three of them. The warmth spread deeper than just cloth. It reached their hearts. Later that night, distant howls echoed across the ruins. Not soldiers this time, but scavenger beasts, creatures that prowled when the moon was high. The sisters stiffened in fear. But Daniel rose instantly, his shard of metal in hand. He stood at the cellar door, ready to fight whatever came. The sisters watched him in silence. Their fear was still there, but it was mixed now with awe. This man had no reason to protect them, no bond of blood, no shared language, yet he stood as though their lives were worth more than his own. The older sister whispered to her little one, "Do you see? He does not need words. He shows us with what he does, that is trust." The younger nodded sleepily, her trust already complete. She whispered Daniel's name softly before her eyes closed. It was the first time she slept without fear. When dawn touched the ruins, a pale light creeping into the cellar, Daniel finally lowered his weapon. He turned to see the sisters asleep under the blanket, their faces peaceful for the first time. He allowed himself a moment of rest, leaning against the wall. But even then, one eye stayed open, guarding them. When the sisters awoke, they found him still there, still watching, still protecting. The younger smiled brightly. The older one bowed her head in quiet respect. And in that fragile moment, the bond was sealed. They were no longer two orphaned, alien sisters and a wandering human. They were something more, something stronger, born not of blood but of choice, trust. The first rays of morning touched the ruined city. Golden light slipped through cracks in the broken walls. The smoke had thinned, the air still heavy, but no longer choking. For the sisters, it was the first sunrise they had truly noticed in weeks, because they were not alone anymore. Daniel was already awake. He had not slept properly, not once. His body ached from keeping watch, but his eyes were steady, sharp. He stood outside the cellar, scanning the streets. The sisters watched him from the shadows. They saw not just a man, but a guardian carved out of hardship. The younger sister tugged at the blanket around her shoulders. She whispered to her older sister, "Do you think he will stay with us always?" The older one hesitated. Her heart feared disappointment. But when she looked at Daniel standing there like an unbroken wall, her lips curved in the smallest smile. "I think he already has." The city was still dangerous. Shouts of patrols echoed in the distance. The sound of engines hummed faintly from the sky. But the ruins also carried signs of life. Here and there, faint figures appeared. Other survivors, weak, broken, searching for food, for family, for safety. The sisters peered out and saw them. Alien families crawling out of hidden places, mothers carrying children, fathers supporting the wounded. Even a few who looked at Daniel with suspicion, fear in their eyes, for to them, humans were still monsters from the war. One survivor stepped forward, a tall alien man, his arm in a sling. He pointed at Daniel, his face twisted with distrust. His voice was harsh, demanding. The sisters didn't understand every word, but they knew the meaning. He wanted Daniel gone. The younger sister clutched her blanket tight. No. He saved us, she whispered desperately. The older one stood firm. She walked in front of Daniel, her thin frame shaking but her voice strong. No, she said in her alien tongue, her words carried into the silent ruins. He is not the enemy, he is family. The other survivors stared, their eyes wide with shock. Two alien children defending a human. It was unthinkable, but Daniel did not move, he did not argue. He simply placed a hand gently on the older sister's shoulder, his eyes calm. The gesture spoke louder than words. He would not leave them. Slowly, the distrust in the crowd softened. They saw the blanket. They saw the sisters clinging to him like he was the last light in the dark. And they saw something, even stronger, hope. That night they had slept in the ashes, cold and forgotten. But this morning warmth surrounded them, not just from the blanket, but from the bond that had formed. Daniel knelt so he could meet the sister's eyes, his face tired but steady. He pointed at the horizon, beyond the ruined buildings, where faint trails of smoke rose from camps, safe zones, maybe shelters. Perhaps his voice was low but firm. We go, he said. The sisters didn't understand the words, but they understood the meaning. Together, they stepped out of the cellar. The sisters held the blanket between them. Daniel walked ahead, every movement cautious but certain. The ruins stretched endlessly, but the dawn painted everything in soft gold. Even the ashes looked less like death, and more like soil, waiting for something new. As they walked, the younger sister whispered to the older, "Do you think he will leave when we find safety?" The older shook her head. No. He chose us when no one else did. He is part of us now. Daniel glanced back. For the first time, he allowed a small smile. It was faint, brief, but it was real. The kind of smile that carried a promise. Step by step, they moved forward, past broken shops, past burned homes, past the place where fear had once chained them. Now, every step carried strength, not just survival, but hope. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one truth was clear. They were no longer lost children in the ashes. They were a family, forged not by blood, but by kindness, by courage, by trust. The blanket around their shoulders was more than cloth. It was proof that even in the coldest night, one act of warmth could change everything. The sisters smiled faintly, holding each other close as they followed Daniel, toward the rising sun, toward a new beginning.